right, today we're going to look at the
Good evening, everybody, and thank you for coming. I'm quite surprised that you've been so regular in coming, because normally by now we should have had like 1 or 2 people in church, because that's the norm for these services wherever one is. But I'm glad that we can meet together in this way. So let us pray. Gracious God, we give you thanks for this time that we will be spending together. We leave all the things of this day in your care, and pray that by your Spirit you would enable us to focus on that which we will be learning tonight. And so I'll pray this prayer from Joyce Rapp. Loving truth bringer, there is always more for us to learn. Your love and grace help us shed our falsity. Enable us to welcome the truth of who we are. Free us from the masks we choose to wear. Reveal more of what has been unknown to us. Clear away what keeps us from being transparent. We open the door of our hearts to you. We open the door. Amen. So I'm going to start. Today we're doing the 7th and 8th commandment. You shall not steal, and you shall not bear false witness. Movies.
Let's look for a few minutes at the 7th commandment, the law of the heart of sharing. Thou shalt not steal. Before deciding that thou shalt not steal is either clear in its meaning or unnecessary in its explanation or obvious in its application, we need to consider 2 pieces of very contemporary information. The first compares the wages U.S. corporations pay their chief executives with the amount paid by other chief executives around the world. In Japan, for instance, CEOs are paid 16 times as much as the average lower wage worker. In Germany, a corporation executive earns 21 times as much as the average employee. In 1980, the CEOs of U.S. corporations received 42 times the wage of an average worker. And by 1990, that ratio had risen to 85 times the pay of the average worker. In 2000, It was 531 times greater than the workers whose labors made those profits possible. Or to put it another way, the United Nations Development Program reported in 1998 that the world's 225 richest people had a combined annual income of the world's 2.5 billion poorest people, or approximately half of the population of the globe. And 60 of those people live in the United States of America. And yet people insist that welfare programs must be cut and that tax breaks are needed to secure the profit margins of the wealthiest companies in the world. In a world such as this, the seventh commandment, thou shalt not steal, is as fresh as this morning's paper. In a world such as ours, the seventh commandment deserves another look. The Hebrew concept of stealing, as it was heard by nomadic, rural, pastoral clans, was far different from the way we read it today. Israel presumed that the function of this commandment was to protect the common property of the clan, the well, so that we could all have water, the grazing land, the sheep, the crops, from being expropriated by any individual for the sake of personal security or profit. In Israel, all property was owned in common and for the sake of the welfare of the total community. God owned the land, they said. They were at best only its keepers. Therefore, to deprive any member of that community of their needs, their share of life, was to sin against God. This concept is still alive and thriving in Native American tribes whose lands, remember, we fenced off for our own designs in the Indian Wars of the 19th century. This concept is still residual in European towns where public grazing rights are still part and parcel of what those societies call the town commons. The town commons is still common grazing land. At Cambridge University in England, for instance, the backs, as they're called, of the university, meaning the open land behind the strip of colleges along the River Cam, are still used for public grazing lands. How do I know? I'll tell you how I know. The cows and I spent many an afternoon together reading on the lawn of the backs. Well, I was reading, they were grazing. Only when the Israelites began to settle in urban areas, in Canaanite towns, did the concept of private property and personal security begin to emerge as another dimension of the common life. And to this day, the notion of private property and its relationship to the common good is a questionable one for us today, to this day, to this month, to this time. When wealthy nations rob underdeveloped nations of their national resources, their labor, and their land at unconscionable prices, can that possibly be morally justified? When I take an Indian child who's working 70 hours a week to make at 15 cents an hour to make shoes that we then sell for $135 a pair, and say we cannot raise that child's wages? Is this not something for which we have the heart for moral evaluation? What happens to the common good then? Or is it really still every man for himself? Therefore, Israel wrote laws to protect the poor from being exploited. Israel wrote laws to protect the poor from being exploited. And as a result, Scripture is filled with warnings against, for instance, using false weights when you're buying grain, or charging interest on debts, or even of holding the cloak of the debtor as collateral overnight, when that cloak was the only thing the poor had to protect themselves from exposure. The laws of charity, the requirement of almsgiving is deep in the Judaic Christian tradition. This distribution of goods to those in need is a great concern, and it's very clear in Judaism. A minimum of 1/10 of one's income, a minimum of 1/10 of one's income, the Jewish community determined belongs to God, to care for those who cannot care for themselves. Or gleaning, we love to use that word in poetry. Gleaning, the right of the poor to glean, to pick up leftovers from the harvested fields, and the responsibilities of the rich to leave leftovers in that field, to leave something behind in the fields for the poor to glean. Assured the poor of their own portion of every harvest, whether they themselves had planted those seeds or not. Remember the story of Ruth? When Ruth and her mother come back to Israel after the father and all the sons have died, how do they support themselves, these two women? They glean. They go through the fields and pick up what's left on the vines and what fell off the cart. They sustain themselves that way. Why? Because the scriptural concept was so deeply embedded in all of it. That wasn't begging. That was living off the common land, off the community family. The first fruits of every yield belong to God. The Hebrew people taught belong, that is, to those in need. Every Jew, even the poor, the Hebrew law dictated, even the poor were expected to give at least 1/3 of a shekel every year to help those even poorer than themselves. There's no talk there of cutting back on welfare so that the rich can get richer. The Bible forbids waste as certainly as it mandates charity. To waste something is to steal it from those who have need of that thing. The social implications of behaviors like that lie heavy on our chests, stop our breathing, make us gasp in the face of our own social principles. Stealing in the biblical sense is not so much a private sin as it is a social sin. This commandment is crying out for us today, yet here and now, to rethink the Western notion that the accommodation and accumulation of wealth is an ideal really worthy of a human life. Is that all the human was born for? To accumulate wealth? It reminds us that sharing is the human imperative, because we all depend on someone else for something. This culture, this generation, has made stealing the template of the business world. With the rise of the middle class and the industrialization of the Western world, we swung away from the scriptural obligation to provide for the poor, to glean for their livelihood. The philosophy of rugged individualism emerged and is now rearing its raging head again. Those who could get, could have. That's what rugged individualism means. Those who could get, could have. Those who could not get died in the gutters of the newly emerging cities. Stealing has become the order of the day in a world bulging with wealth and teeming with poor at the same time. You shall not steal has been reduced in this culture to mean no shoplifting, no pilfering, no pickpockets, no petty theft. And all the while, the poor are getting poorer, their children getting less educated, their infants getting less strong, and getting rich has become the great indoor sport of cheating the consumer and increasing corporate profits and narrowing airplane aisles and reducing the size of the seats to get more people on, more people on, more people. Make the cattle car mentality the ultimate level of the field, rather than enriching the entire community in security, in decency, in dignity, and enabling the universal search for the fullness of our humanity. Yahweh says to Moses in the burning bush, I have heard the cry of my people, and I mean to deliver them. Maybe this century should take that warning seriously again. Stealing in this culture has become high art. Corporations do it with pension funds. Politicians do it by siphoning off money from one project to another. Packagers do it by inflating the size of the product box and reducing the weight of the product. Vendors do it by charging what the traffic will bear rather than what the traffic is worth. Students are doing it. Students, our children, have learned from us well. They do it now with camera phones and computers. Stealing itself has become big business to the point that we now take it for granted. Of course they'll do it, we say. Friedrich Schiller put it this way: it is criminal to steal a purse. It is daring to steal a fortune. It is a mark of greatness to steal the crown. The blame now diminishes as the guilt increases. It may be time to give the seventh commandment more attention than we have been in the last 50 years if we ever want to be able to trust one another again. Only when we cultivate those dimensions of life that have something to do with life itself, rather than simply with wealth, can we ever become a truly honest people again, who sit back in horror at the thought of stealing from the poor down the street.
So while Sister Joan gives a lot of comparisons in America, we can apply it equally to us here in South Africa. One of the things that struck me, a few things, and I'm going to be a bit out of sequence as to what she was saying. She was mentioning packaging. The packaging is smaller and the content is less. Have you seen those chocolates? The size of the chocolates have shrunk. What used to be 100 grams is 80 grams. Ask me, I'm a chocoholic. So it's everything has shrunken. Have you ever checked your toothpaste? You know the toothpaste box has gotten shorter and the contents is now medium size, not a large one. And so it's so done so subtly and we don't see it. She also in her book speaks of people using leasing plans. So often, and I think for those of you who being church wardens or whatever in your places of work, companies would lease photocopiers, and at the end of the lease they'll come around and say you can actually buy this photocopier, it will only cost you 30,000 or something like that. And within a year they'll tell you that while you're still paying it off, they will tell you they don't have pots for it any longer. And so there's this ongoing exploitation that happens. But if I look around this room, I know that you, like me, grew up in a world where we didn't have food with sell-by dates on it, use-by dates on it. And suddenly there is a lot of wastage of foods as a result of sell-by dates. I know when my daughter comes and visits me, she goes through my cupboard to check the dates on the food. And she will not eat anything that says, oh no, that had to be eaten 3 weeks ago, Mommy, you can get rid of it. But we grew up without having those type of limitations put on us. And in the meantime, there are so many hungry people. The thing that Joan says is, you shall not steal, really means you shall keep your integrity. Above all, that you will keep your integrity. Here in South Africa, after the miracle of our first democratic vote, the birth of our Rainbow Nation, and the liberation from unjust laws, we then had promises of prosperity for the poor. It lasted for a while, and now we're sitting looking at how far we have come with all the corruption and how the rich have taken from the poor and the poor have become poorer. One of the things I really need to say to you as the parish of St. Andrews is your commitment to sharing, your commitment to giving. And I think that is, it's the way of God. The more you give, the more you get. You don't run short. But you are so committed in that. But this law actually this commandment just calls us back to consider just how big the commandment is when we apply it to ourselves in the here and now. Enough talking. Next. You can't go more about how to run a Monday.
Now we're going to talk about the 8th commandment, the heart of the law of speech. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. The Josephson Institute of Ethics has been surveying the ethics of American youth every year since 1992. In 2002, the cynicism factor, the notion that, quote, a person has to lie or cheat sometimes in order to succeed, jumped from 9% to 43% among our youth. A person has to lie or cheat sometime in order to succeed. What's more, the numbers in every category tested are increasing substantially from year to year. They have not dropped at all. They're increasing every single year. And finally, the most surprising finding of them all, of the 12,000 students tested, listen carefully, it was students at religious high schools who were more likely to cheat and lie. The scary thing Michael Josephson, president of the Josephson Institute of Ethics, said, is that so many kids are entering the workforce to become corporate executives, politicians, airplane mechanics, and nuclear inspectors with the dispositions and skills of cheaters and thieves. The thought of a corporate culture vitiated at its core by a total disregard for truth, by the people who control it, turns upside down the very linchpin of our entire society. If we cannot trust one another to make an honest contract, to provide honest information, to function honestly in interpersonal relations, what can we trust about our society as a whole? Its professionals, its bankers, its politicians. The ideas are ominous ones, I think, for the nature of our personal relationships, for the integrity of our businesses, and for the future of the country. In order to solve a problem, we have to be able to name the problem. The questions that the 8th commandment confront us with are these. How is it that a traditional regard for truth seems to be in danger? How is that happening? And 2, what are we teaching the next generation about the nature of success in this culture? There are 2 historical dimensions that underline the 8th commandment. The first has to do with giving public witness about an issue. It is a dimension of honesty and truth-telling that applies directly to the legal system. Interestingly enough, this law was common to all cultures of the Middle East. It was, in fact, an attempt to protect the legal system itself from dishonesty and perversion. To fail to guard your legal system from the cancer of dishonesty they knew would be the most serious misuse of a judicial system. It would also be an attack on the reputation of the accused and perhaps any hope for his future, if not even for his life. Lying, these people knew, in other words, was no small thing. This was not just a slip of the tongue. The Code of Hammurabi said that in the event a false accuser was unmasked, that person was to receive the very punishment for which he had exposed the accused. Now think of that. Think of that for a minute. To accuse a person of a murder later discovered to have been found guilty and executed because of your false witness would make you yourself in that culture liable to execution. You would get what you threatened the accused with. The point is, they were saying, think carefully and think twice before you try anything like that. The message in all these cultures was clear. When the level of witness is a public one, it demands the most stringent commitment to factual truth, which is why we are so hard on perjury. To perjure yourself on an issue can become more serious than the issue itself. But there's also a second level of false witness to consider. This second dimension treats speech as a sacred act. It's far more subtle in its effects than the first that we just discussed, but it's also far more troublesome. This dimension is least understood in a world where false advertising is a given, where hype and exaggeration are seldom confronted, and where the commercial world builds its testimony, depends on the gullibility or likelihood to believe the authority of print or personal endorsements. So you see us now, beginning in our legal system, to bring to task some of these advertisers who in the packages you buy say an antidote to cancer. No proof whatsoever of that. None whatsoever. Or the fastest car on the road, or the most well-built, or the internet with the highest power. No proof for any of those things. Just adjectives and labels and exaggeration. You see, speech, the Hebrew community knew, is godlike. That's the sacred dimension of it, because like God, what we say creates our world. And God said, let there be trees, and there were trees. And God said, let there be animals, and there were animals. What we say, let there be buyers, and there are buyers, but they've all been scammed. They've all been robbed of something. What we say defines us first as the type of person we are. Once you're discovered, honest or dishonest, full of integrity or bankrupt of soul, and it makes the world around us at the same time real or not real, trustworthy or false. Would we recognize a well-built car if we saw it? Saying that it is does not make it so, but it can make so a world in jeopardy and a life in danger. It gives life. Speech gives life, and speech takes life. Speech promises and guarantees, or it makes the world a slippery slope of a place to be. You can't trust anybody. Would you buy this car from this man? Is there anything here? Do I have any sense of a tradition of truth where I come from, in my office, in the store I buy from, in the materials that I'm using? To lie violates human relationships. It violates trust. It erodes personal relationships. It contaminates the credibility of the self. Who can look at me again in exactly the same way? The lies I tell are besmirching me, and when they are discovered, it's over. Worse than that, perhaps, lying also separates me from my very self. The more I lie, the more truth turns to putty in my own mind. It gets hard. After I've told the story 1,000 times, I no longer know what is really true about it or about me at all. I myself have lost touch with what I really think. I tell you what you want me to say. I lose touch with what I really did. Was it heroic or was it mundane? I lose touch with what I really said. And so it violates not just me, but the image of God in me, who is all loving, all pure, all true. When I destroy that image of God in myself, I am destroying the very essence of my spiritual soul. But the tradition also tells us that there are two kinds of truth. And we can't lose sight of either or both of them when we talk about lying. I think the two are best understood, at least I love the stories, by remembering the story of the two major theological schools that underpin the entire Talmud. There's the school of Hillel and the school of Shammai, and they talk about lying and truth. The Talmud raised this question: how does one praise a bride while dancing before her at her wedding, which is part of the Jewish wedding tradition? Well, the school of Shammai said, why, you would describe the bride as she is. And the school of Hillel came back and said, you must describe the bride as beautiful and full of grace. The school of Shammai argued the point, but suppose she's lame or blind? Ugly is one to say, oh, bride, full of grace. knowing that Scripture declares, keep away from anything false. And the school of Hillel replied to the school of Shammai, if a person makes a bad purchase in the marketplace, should a friend praise it to his face or belittle it? And Shammai answered, well, surely, we should praise that to his face. The sages also inferred, they went on, that we should always endeavor to be pleasant to other people. Think, the principle's a wonderful one. If no one gains unjustly by the lying, the lie does not profane us. I had a sister friend who was wont to say when I crowed at her, Lois, you can't say that. She'd say, Joan, what is obviously not the truth is obviously not a lie. I learned a lot about what my second grade teacher hadn't told me. We have a responsibility as well in our speech to keep private things private. We have a right not to expose ourselves to the world and a responsibility not to expose another's privacy to the world. The desire for privacy does not make our speech unholy. You do not have to tell that your husband was in jail for 20 years for attempted murder of his last wife. If somehow or other it's not bothering you, you don't have to say a word about it. Nor does the intent to be kind make our speech untrue. However, if someone gains unjustly, I repeat, by the lying, then the tradition would say we have besmirched creation and profaned the self. Stealing is one thing, but lying is another. Stealing takes something from someone. Lying takes from people what they are, their reputation, their understanding, the very quality of their lives. It also takes those things, remember, from the one who lies, as well as from the one who's lied about. Thou shalt not lie is meant to preserve an entire people from the corrosive effects of a culture of deceit. If the moral content of this culture is to be guaranteed, we must save the next generation from the false definitions of success that force them into cheating and lying in order to meet our expectations of them. The 8th word of the Decalogue in society is honesty. Honesty is the glue of the human race, and our children must begin to see it as more a merit of great treasure than a great salary.
The first thing that came to mind when I was listening to that now is, how wives always ask their husbands, honey, do I look okay? Are you sure? And they say, of course you look lovely. In the meantime, the wife knows, look, I'm not so sure about this. So it appears that that is an okay lie then, according to her. But that is very important. The fact that speech is a sacred act. What we say, what I say defines me as a person. Sometimes when people lie, they get such a funny look in their face. You can see easily that they're telling lies. Other people are good. They're very good. But I like the part of this, the second part of what she says about bearing false witness. And it's all about what we say. That speech is so sacred. And that we hurt each other terribly. She writes in a book, Truth, like surgery, may hurt, but it cures. And the burden that we are under, if we've told a lie, to remember that we told that lie, or else our story just doesn't hold water. And in the end, everybody knows you've told a lie because the story will get out there that, no, but she said that. No, but they did that. She says that we must teach the difference between speech that is holy and the gossip, slander, and lying that destroys the very fabric of the human community. Lying takes from people what they are, their reputation, their understanding, and the quality of their lives. Lying obscures the real self, even from ourselves. And it is true what she says. In the end, we don't even know what is truth any longer as we build this story. The lie becomes so big, it almost becomes a reality to the person who's told the lie. It's easier not to do that. Yeah, I suppose I could go on forever, but Joan has done it so well. Let me see, what have I got here, page 107. She says, lying is what makes us suspect in everything else in life. If I myself am not honest, who can I possibly believe? And that is, there's such a depth to that because we project, or what we believe of ourselves is what we will project onto others. So if we tell so many lies, we won't trust people. She says it isn't that truth is rewarded. So this is for those husbands, eh? It isn't that truth is rewarded. It is that truth needs no reward. Truth is its own reward. It requires no memory, no elaborate explanations, no conspiring confederates, and no fear of exposure. You have your, there are some handouts and some questions for you to reflect on and share with each other, and I'll give you some time to do just that.